I am so excited for today's webinar for this month. We are going to be focused on how to describe and define and communicate the impact that medical affairs is having in a way that is crisper and cleaner than I've ever seen. And let me tell you how this session got on the calendar today. I was at MAPS in Denver this year and had the privilege of sitting through what I told everybody in the MAPS organization was the best session I had been a part of in over 5 years at MAPS. When I got to sit and hear about how care gaps and TPO, which we're going to talk about today, has been implemented in real life. And it was such a great session that I had to reach out to my co-host today. He has been all over the medical affairs stage recently with white papers and podcasts and again, two amazing presentations. Troels Sørensen is the global head, hello there, of clinical practice at Boehringer Ingelheim, leads medical affairs partnerships, implementation science, and this whole TPO methodology. And as I got to know Troels and we started talking, over 25 years, he's been doing this across, uh, what is it, Roche, AZ, Novartis, many more. And chances are you've come across his work. If you are here because you're interested in care gaps, or if you've heard that target population outputs, you have come across his work because he has pioneered this until eventually it was also introduced by the Harvard Health System Innovation Lab. So glad that you're joining us today, Tools. Welcome, and you want to say hello and continue on with the introduction.
Thanks, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, everybody, for making the time. Scott's being very, very generous, as hopefully you'll see as we go through. It's all very simple. It's taking concepts which have been around in different places for a long time and just structuring it in a logical fashion. I think you'll all see things which are very recognizable, and it's all about just getting our heads around it and selling it to the organizations we're in order to make our lives a bit more straightforward and impactful. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you, Scott, for creating this opportunity.
What we're going to go through today, because it's your Q&A. So many of you, I think we had, what was it, Charles? 62 questions that came in. If we summarize them down, we had your questions that came in. And so we're going to spend most of our time answering your questions. For those of you who watched the video, and most of you did, just as a quick reminder, right? The framework that we're going to talk about today is about answering three questions, right? Really, first, what is our impact? And it starts with the patient journey and all the decisions that get made by the along the care of patients. And then when there is a difference between what evidence says should happen at a decision and not every patient getting that decision, right? There's a gap. And we're going to talk more in detail about a measurement of that called target population output, or TPO. And that is basically where we look at the patients that are receiving that evidence-based care. Well, a lot of your questions have to do with what do you mean by evidence, divided by the patients at that stage in the journey ready for that decision. Then we're going to start, as Troels talks about, add logic models regarding, well, what do you do about it? So if this is the gap, first, why is there a gap? We use insights, we use data to verify why it's there, what's causing it, and then drill into what can medical affairs do about it. Look across all of the parts of medical planning, look at how we engage with the medical community, and that is essentially the process. And so, again, if you missed the video, there's a more detailed explanation of it. We also have some slides that Troels has offered to share that will give us even more clarification on this. But that is the framework that we're going to be discussing today. Is there anything to add before we jump into the discussion?
No, other than just delightful to see that many people are already tackling care gaps, actually working with it, which is exactly where we need to go as an industry. And delighted to hear from yourselves, but also seeing through the questions the potential barriers you're hitting, and hopefully we can add a little bit of advice around that.
I think that is a really, really good place for us to go next. Um, when we've done care gap work, I've heard, and from our conversation, I hear kind of three challenges fairly often. One, having a defined, compliant, and meaningful measurement of impact. I hear challenges, and it's in your questions around data not being clean, accessible, easy to analyze, and also, even if you do have all that, these are big, complex organizations that require a lot of change management and alignment. Maybe to Troll's question, can everybody just in the chat, regardless of what stage you're in with care gaps, what has been your biggest challenge? If you could walk away solving one challenge from today, what is it? Right? What is your biggest challenge? It could be one of the three that I put there. It could be something else that we didn't write down. What is your biggest challenge in this care gap impact TPO work? Let's see what it is. Okay. More comprehensive data without gaps. Okay, so maybe you haven't found a gap. Maybe add more a little clarification. The data to establish it. Okay. The measurement, the analytics, the data. Oh, yeah. So oftentimes we jump right into, well, if we're going to have a strategy, it's on the MSL to go close it. Holes in the data. Okay. More data issues. What else do you have? What are the biggest challenges? We want to make sure this is useful to you. So share your challenges and we can share some stories about what we're seeing work. Okay, so data is retrospective. It's historical, right? Right, and our actions might be 12 to 18 months after that gap has changed. Gotcha. Identifying the care gaps prior to study design. Okay. Measurable data. The speed of innovation in a disease area. Love that. Maybe add why is that a challenge? Come on, there's a lot of you on the list. Let's get a few more in here. Choosing the right care gap. Yeah, just because you found one doesn't mean it's one that we need to choose to prioritize, right? So we'll definitely talk through that. Trolls, as you're reading these, any of these standing out to you as the big ones you experienced?
I think a lot of it starts with positioning in the organization, that we're absolutely clear of what are we all trying to change here. One of the things we've tried to do is a care gap is quite a broad concept. When you talk about care gap, some people refer to what I would call often root causes. A care gap would be not enough MRI machines in the institute, for example. A care gap could be not enough of our ACPs believe it is important to test for a biomarker. The reason why we've chosen to put this new term, target population output, or we've been using it for about 6 years now in a few different companies, is to be hyper specific of what we mean by a quantified care gap. And in the name specifically, target population output, target population comes from the TPP. So number one, we say, who are we talking about? It's the one we've identified in the TPP. It should be the first line of the TPP, which is the target population we hope eventually would be benefited from the innovations that we bring. Output comes from logic models, and we can go in a little bit more about that, but it's very simple of what are you trying to achieve? The ultimate goal would be clinical outcomes that we have in our registrations for trials. Clinical outcomes are rubbish for assessing benefit in populations because they take more typically than a year to measure. Logic models break these down into steps. So an output would be, so a clinical outcome might be the number of patients in remission, for example. An output would be the number of patients at a care gap. Indicators would be belief and behaviors, and of course, eventually our activities. So what we do with TPPs is we express the proportion of patients at a given point as a percentage. That means you're forced to say, where am I coming from on a patient journey and where am I going? So In summary, there, looking at some of the questions, I think number one says, are we all clear what we're talking about? And for me, there's a massive advantage at looking at the percentage of patients at a particular point in their patient journey. Why? Because you can actually link it in to the business assumptions of the organization. Now there, Scott, you said it's polite company we're in, but I'm going to use the F word, and the F word being forecast. And I think this will trigger the next questions around compliance. I'll finish off just saying the advantage of using this methodology of focusing on the proportion of patients at a point in patient journey is that you can link it directly into the commercial assumptions, and you can do it compliantly. The moment you do that, you speak the language of the organization, and that's where the possibilities open up.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, while we had many questions submitted in advance, if you have any questions that you would like to have us answer, please put them right there in the chat, and we will definitely answer them. And we actually already have one, which is, can you elaborate more on what you just said?
We're calling target population output. Call it anything you like in the organization. For the organization I work for at the moment, we actually call it something different. Why? Because lexicon and words is important. TPO is just like, if you like, Scott said, it came originally from Harvard. It's the academic sort of definition. But you need to find a word that fits into your organization, be it, a strategic KPI for health systems or elsewhere. But nevertheless, as a background definition, this is what it is. It's a percentage of patients with a specific condition at a specific stage in a healthcare journey within a health system. So we'd be hyper-specific about what is the population linked to the TPP, where are the patients on the patient journey, and within what health system. And that's very simple. Then the numerator and the denominator. Again, it forces the discipline of saying, where are the patients? Perhaps if we go to the next slide, please, Scott. And very simple, it's always expressed as percentage for the reasons I explained. It could be anything on the patient journey. So we call these output because they're changes of movement of patients along the patient journey. Anything from patient activation, screening, diagnosis, referral, treatment, monitoring, adherence. If we get all those right, if patients move up to best current standard of care, and I choose my word carefully because it may not be on our assets, but if we're still moving them up to the best current standard of care, patient outcomes, which be remission, response, etc., will improve. I suggest perhaps we just go to slide 6, Scott, which is where the next one, please, I think it is. Yes. Those percentages, those care gaps or TPOs, are the same as what should have been defined in the patient funnel in our forecast. The forecast, the top part, or 90% of the patient funnel is nothing to do with our assets, as you know. It's about the health system. It starts with epidemiology, and it's about where are the patients and where they're going. A TPO, you could actually say in many ways, it's just the delta between 2 points in patient funnel. Once we've agreed what the priority care gaps are, which should already be defined in your patient funnel, then we slot them into the logic model, and that's what I was describing earlier, right in the middle between interventions and impact. The advantage of that is we can now say, well, what are the stakeholders that affect these care gaps? And for each stakeholder, what is the belief and the behavior change we seek? And what are the activity metrics, including the evidence behind those activities that we need to achieve that? And that gets us away from doing activities and activity metrics for the sake of activities and showing that we're really busy. It also gets us away from this look at belief, that look how much the KOLs love us, look how much the HSPs understand this. But the question is, what is the behavior and what is the change? So it allows us to create a clear logical flow. And perhaps just as a last slide, just in answer to this, I think it's 2 slides on. We sometimes call this the KPI house. What it means is you say the TPO is the movement of patients that leads to clinical outcomes and leads to greater social and economic benefits, which you can model. But you apply that to every stakeholder into what is their behavior, their belief, the activity we put in, and the evidence behind it. And there you can see we can clearly carve out, now this is a pan-enterprise framework. It's not a medical affairs framework, it's pan-enterprise. But hopefully you can see how we as medical affairs can find our slot. What is our contribution to this? And I'm choosing my words carefully, Scott, because we all know this discussion between attribution and contribution. Let's not make medical affairs activity a defensive thing where we try to justify our existence and our headcount and our budget, rather than define what are we contributing overarchingly amongst other functions to these goals. So sorry, that was perhaps a bit more of an elaboration, but hopefully it gives people a bit of a foothold, and thanks for the question.
Yeah, I hope that helps for everybody. Well, let's jump into some of the questions that came in. And again, feel free to drop any additional questions you have, and we'll go from there. So the first set of questions are about identifying, selecting, prioritizing TPOs or care gaps. So let's start with, what is the difference between a care gap and an unmet medical need? Aren't they the same thing, Troels?
They could easily be, and I think we one of the things we suffer from is a lot of words and lexicon on this range, and I think they could be the same thing, but I'm probably more concerned about just defining what is the specific measure and change we wish to achieve. What I like to do is saying, if it's an unmet medical need or care gap, what is the prioritized unmet medical need? What is the prioritized block of movement of patients, and focus immediately on number of patients in that block. So I would say for this one here, they are highly related to each other, but I think our trick, or your challenge within your organization, is to create a sharp definition of each. My proposal is that whatever you call it, you define it by movement of patients. The moment you define it by movement of patients, you can plug into the language of the organization.
Well, you just said something that I found interesting in the workshop regarding how you go about doing that prioritization. One of the biggest mistakes that I find teams do is that they outsource that logic and that decision to the analytics function or to the analytics provider. But I think you had shared that you actually take a different approach. Can you share just what does that look like?
We've all been in these workshops where we draw out the patient journey, and we spend 2 days with a very elaborate map. We might even get an artist in to do a summary to make it look a little bit more friendly. But at the end of those 2 days, we step back and say, oh my God, this is complex. What I find extremely useful is that you then take an additional step, which is, where are the patients on that complex patient journey map that we've been writing? But then saying, if we were to change that into a flow of patients, a single dimensional flow, how would we categorize that? And once we've got that, then we start getting a sense of where are patients getting stuck. We start with the epidemiology and where they're moving to ideally best current standard of care. And then we say, so what is our biggest priority in alleviating those gaps? And very importantly, and this I'm speaking from my own experience, if we alleviate one gap, do we actually create another gap? And I've definitely been, made that mistake in the past. Perhaps if we very quickly flash up slide number 5, Scott, then it's a very quick illustration of what that process is. So basically, my advice is that you start with patient journey, but you make a clear link to the patient funnel, which is what our commercial colleagues are working on as well. So as we say, the mapping of the journey, quantifying it into a linear flow, and then you prioritize it into, which essentially are the ones that you have agreed with your data analytics function, with your own real-world evidence function, are the priority gaps.
Over the last several months, as we've done these sessions, I find that the journeys and what the potential gaps are often already known by the team. It's very helpful to have data to verify, quantify, validate, challenge, but not necessarily to go poke through millions of rows of data hoping to find the logic.
I think one of my favorite quotes is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think we also have to, I think in medical affairs, we all come from data backgrounds. We love data. But I think the key here is that we get enough information and measurement, in this case, of where patients are, to be able to make decisions, in this case, prioritizing our tactics and where to intervene. And I think it's a little bit in medical affairs, our role to pop out of our comfort zone, which is absolute data rigor, to get to a point of, do we know enough to start taking action? One of my colleagues actually in the US, in where I work at the moment, has actually proposed doing a medical affairs t-shirt that says, nobody cares about your p-values, which is a bit harsh, but it's making the distinction between p-values for clinical trials, registration, evidence-based medicine, absolutely. But when it comes to measuring patients in complex health systems where data is not always complete, we need to learn to step out of our comfort zone. That data is not always perfect, but what is enough data for us to be able to start acting?
We had a question dropped in the chat just now that if a gap is more upstream in the funnel, should it be prioritized, or is it really based on the patient numbers and what we can influence?
Brilliant question. And I think this comes down to also how much time you have. One of the things that really annoys me about our launch discussions often is that should we start 24 months before, 36 months, or 48 months before? And in my mind, it depends on where you are with your patient journey. If all your patients are stuck in pre-primary care and you need your patients to self-present to primary care, for example, in mental health, you're going to have to start a lot earlier. And it's a much bigger ocean to boil. But also you're assessing essentially where your patients, where's the priorities. It will also differ by market. In some markets, they may be a different distribution of it. So I think you start with where the need is biggest for you to have the time to achieve your forecast assumptions of essentially the market size. The market size is just the number of patients who end up being treated by best current standard of care, where hopefully they're responding to the best current, cheapest treatments. But through that, you identify the refractory ones. Those, of course, are the candidates for our innovation. It may be worth just touching on compliance here, because this is going to come up anyway.
Okay.
Since our colleague was talking about where in the patient journey, the further up you are or high up in the patient funnel or left side of the patient journey, the earlier in the patient journey you are, the easier it is to have the compliance discussion because you're far away from the use of the asset. As you get closer to what would be the use of our assets, that's where you need to be a little bit more clear, and you create the guardrails in complete alliance with your legal compliance colleagues. And that's where, for example, a TPO that says at the bottom of the patient funnel or the right-hand side of the patient journey, which would be, let's say, the percentage of patients treated with biologics. That's probably fine and compliant if there's 10 biologics. But if you're the only biologic, or if there's only 2 biologics, then of course we get into the space where we could be accused of just having a proxy sales measure, which wouldn't be appropriate. Doesn't mean you can't measure that TPO, but that wouldn't be the medical affairs department, for example. So I just slotted that in because I think that's the elephant on the table, the legal and compliance.
Yeah. And Troels, one of the things that was interesting is I was talking to some colleagues that while you might not hold accountability to a TPO around treatment decision, because that's beyond what our role is, it sounded as though because you're having meaningful conversations about real gaps in care, it sounds like the opportunity to have those conversations seem to go up anyway.
Yes, I think having that clear definition and mandate within your organization, and let's say that a little bit earlier in the patient journey, where it would be, for example, proportion of patients on current guideline-directed medical therapy within standard of care, so not innovation, for example, or earlier referral to secondary care or screening with a biomarker. These are usually goals shared by the health system. They always also want to optimize or strengthen their system by getting patients up to the current best standard of care. So what I find is that even having the mandate in the organization to be spending resources to make these changes opens doors when you go to health systems. It opens doors for collaboration. It opens doors for for data as well, because whereas we have our sources of data, there are also registries, etc., where if you can get alliances going, you can get access to new sources of measurement.
Let's tackle this data question. So, we've used the word evidence, right? That, treatment compared to evidence versus those not. What degree of evidence is required? Does it have to be guidelines, or would you classify that more broadly?
So if we're speaking here about finding or defining where the patients are and the care gap, only evidence that is enough for either yourself as an organization, but ideally also the stakeholders, the health system stakeholders, to be satisfied that we have enough evidence to start taking an action. Where at all, if you ever can, is start your modeling in collaboration with your health system stakeholders. Because there you're also with those stakeholders saying, well, what data is available? Where are the patients on the journey of care? And how much evidence do we need and agree that we need in order to take action? And if you are dealing with a relatively new disease area, you may find that survey data would be welcomed by health system stakeholders because there's no other data out there, and they will welcome you with open arms. If you're in more established diseases, then there are already registries available within professional societies, etc. And you may need to earn the right and saying, listen, we wish to change or improve the patient journey. In this case, we're not talking about our product. We're talking about bringing patients along. Would you be open to a collaboration where we gain access to your data or that we share data sources? So in the end, it is very bespoke to the health system and the disease, what level of evidence would be required. And in many cases, I found in my experience, it doesn't need to be highly statistical power because in the end, we're all wishing to be highly pragmatic in having enough evidence just to make decisions and get started.
I really like that. One of the teams that I'm working with on this methodology got really excited because they felt like they had some data that they can actually show the HCPs about their zip code, maybe even about their institution and their own practice. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've used that data, and mentioning that it has to be credible to the organization you're presenting it to?
And yeah, you're mentioning maps, and we had the great opportunity that some of our colleagues were showing how claims data in the US has been used to actually being able to be drilled down literally to and you're lucky in the States with claim data to local data about where patients are in the current patient journey. This is also very appealing to US health systems, individual health systems in setting the question, what are we even understanding here? So it's highly useful for the organization because, of course, it's about where do we prioritize our activities, our educational events, let's say, the importance of screening with a biomarker as well. So all in all, it becomes a very, very powerful way for us to ask, what is the problem we're trying to solve? I might as well again preempt because you kindly sent me the questions beforehand. Is that in the US, of course, and I know that most of the participants here are in US, you are so-called spoiled because of claims data. It's not complete. It's not going to answer all your questions. What about outside the US? The overwhelming experience I have is that you can definitely pursue quantified care gap TPO methodology without claims data. A well-designed surveys is probably the low end of the spectrum, but it's definitely something that I've seen teams being able to work with to make decisions. Very often, again, starting even with survey data opens up doors to new sources of data, as I mentioned. And Scott and I were just talking just before the call, is that in many ways, this is also preparing us for what will inevitably, and is that already happening, which is access to AI analytics and electronic health records. I've seen some absolutely astounding pilots of literally live updated patient journeys with some pilots we've been running. And electronic health records are used in the States, they're used in Malaysia, they're used in Australia. So this will be a fantastic democratization of data access. So in many ways, I see us starting thinking and using currently available data sources is only setting us up for what is just around the corner, which is electronic health records and live analysis of that. So let's just get into that gear and mindset now.
Yeah, I agree. There should definitely be, there's been a shift just within the last 6 months where like when we're running a 2-day workshop on this, like we're taking the logic from day one, running analysis overnight and being able to challenge and validate and pressure test those the next day. And yeah, you might do more validation after, but the ability to use data that quickly is just fantastic. However, for a lot of the questions and challenges that people put at the beginning, the data is not always clean. So this was one of the questions that came in. How are you going to handle where patient registries are incomplete, claims is lagging, real world evidence varies? How do we have confidence that this data is actually accurate?
So one of my biggest mistakes, and I've made many, was that in one of these type of projects, I tried to centralize globally because I'm typical global, one of these irritating people that tries to create standards, qualities, and rules. And I tried to set standards for statistical rigor, for example, and measurement methodology. And I pretty much killed the project overnight. We did a complete U-turn. We said, everything now is a local decision. You choose the measurement and you set the baseline. You set the targets of the care gaps that you wish to alleviate in line with your and compliantly with your forecasts, and you express it as a percentage. Where am I versus my target? And so it becomes much more of a locally driven matter. So therefore, in terms of the gaps in the data, that is where you decide is where am I going to create properties for understanding this? So are there other sources that I can get around? How in absolute absence of data, what are the best quality surveys that I can use and that I will trust? The only measures you need to choose are the ones that you would trust enough to course correct if you believe you're not on target.
We had a question just dropped in around, are there new tools coming out that allows us to see patients as they visit more than one health system?
Oh, I'm afraid that's a very specific US question. So
Very. So one thing that I see, I appreciate the question because we actually had that scenario come up, and because we were able to see the timeline, like when you have the raw data, you can find the path, but oftentimes by the time we get it, it's already been summarized 1 or 2 levels up, and then it's really hard to find that. So, yes, there are, once you have the raw data, I am finding that AI platforms are much better at finding the connection points between.
I would
Yeah.
say, don't wait for AI. Don't wait for electronic health record accessibility. Even with arguably the lowest strength of data, which would be survey data, you can absolutely apply this because you only need enough information for you to be able to make tactical course corrections if you need to do so.
Well, the next question that we have is, now that we start to select TPOs, right, how do we prove that we caused that change as it closes?
I think this is where we also, it comes back to that attribution versus contribution discussion. If as an organization we agree and we need to achieve this change in a TPO, so we need to, let's say, get diagnosis up from 40% to 60% over the next 3 years, whatever is in our assumptions. It's not going to be only medical affairs. It's not going to, the access teams may also have activities. If it's post-launch, commercial meals. Using that sort of framework, sort of the KPIs before, we distribute those amongst the specialties or the functions that focus on those stakeholders. There may also be competition. There may be the health systems working on it. The main thing is we achieve the target, not necessarily saying we attribute it's gone to this particular party or not. What we can do is do a contribution analysis where it says, with a reasonable assessment, are we making an effect on this change? Now, you can do this with human intelligence of just eyeballing the data, but you can also try to look whether you can get some analytics into it. And you'll see that a lot of solution providers are specifically looking at that, saying, can we get some analytics to help us with this contribution discussion? But what I would definitely urge you is to, especially in medical affairs, we have unfortunately this existentialist disease in medical affairs where we try to feeling we're having to justify our existence, either by how busy we are with busyness metrics, or by vanity metrics, which is, how much the external experts love us, etc. I'm being a bit dramatic here, but on purpose. But I think we have all the capabilities and all the impact to justify a contribution approach, which is how we contributing to these changes. If we're not achieving the changes, then it's a question of course correction. And can we, with some degree of reason, say which tactics we need to change in order to come back on course again.
Appreciate that. Let's talk a little bit more about selecting and prioritizing. So 2 related questions. The first is, what happens as you're going through this process and you get insights, you see something in the patient journey and it contradicts maybe the brain strategy? And then another related question, how do you manage a situation where closing the care gap benefits patients, but also happens to benefit a competitor more than you?
First, on the insights, I worry often, again, in medical affairs, of this emphasis on insights and the number of insights we gather almost as a goal in its own right. I'm horrified when I hear stories of MSLs being given a quantitative amount of insights to gather as a target. And we all know the rules of what you put in is what you get out. One of the advantages of this sort of red thread KPI frameworks is that insights should be driven by any barrier you encounter as you're doing this. So why am I encountering this barrier? And if you are encountering insights that are suggesting that actually we're focusing on the wrong care gap, for example, you already have a framework to articulate and saying, if we continue on this, we're missing this other care gap and it's going to have this effect on our assumptions. You're speaking the language of the organization. So I think I believe strongly actually that having this kind of framework makes our insights so much clearer, or insight gathering so much clearer. It makes insight gathering purposeful. Now, this is only going to help our competition question. The approach you will get is, well, unless you're the market leader, you shouldn't grow the market. And growing the market is the same as healthy system strengthening. Now, if you're working for Procter & Gamble or Unilever and you're selling washing powder, I'd be happy to accept that, because if you're benefiting the competition, you're just making those organizations richer who are selling 50 or 100 different products, and they will generally be more competitive too. So I can accept that if we're selling washing powder. In specialty medical care, you're dealing who are our competitors very often specifically on that disease, but very often not any other disease. So the argument that you're just benefiting company X and they will come back and get you in all kinds of other diseases, it doesn't hold true. The other thing is that is your return of investment positive? And I'm afraid I'm going to speak a bit more commercially again. If it benefits you, does it really matter whether it benefits the competition? If it actually is good for your organization, does that really matter? The other thing is there's more suggestion that as you're testing your channels of communication, let's say through increased screening diagnosis, especially pre-launch, you are testing those channels. If you are, with credibility, changing the behavior of future prescribers, you've earned the right, as we often say to our sales reps, you've earned the right to sell. You've established a relationship. So these are the three sort of business arguments. But I'll finish with the ethical argument, is that we've all joined healthcare for a reason. We've got a duty to make a profit. But at the same time, if our mere presence in a health system is a force for good, let's imagine that the product in phase 3 fails, but that we've been working for 3 years to improve the TPOs. And we've risk adjusted it. The products failed, but that was part of our risk adjustment for that investment. We exit that market, but more patients are now diagnosed and treated with best standard care. Then we've left a positive footprint. And that is very much my hope, is that we articulate very clearly the positive benefit we bring to society. And for those patients that don't respond to best standard care, then we earn the right to bring our innovation and sell that innovation. So a bit of a long question, but it presses a button of mine.
Wonderful. I can't add anything there. Troels, let's share, because we're coming up on kind of our last section here. Let's talk about you can do a workshop in a couple of days and identify care gaps. You could take a couple of days and analyze them and get to the decisions and the logic models. But the next day, your whole organization isn't all working collaboratively to close those gaps. So could you share a little bit about, I know you've done this a few times now. Tell everybody about the first couple of people you met with when you got to Boehringer, and kind of the lessons you've learned in implementation.
So my first meeting was with my boss to thank her for giving me the position. My second meeting was with legal and compliance, and essentially saying, this is what I am intending to work on with this organization. How do you feel? And that starts the beginning of those guardrails. I have never had a legal and compliance person saying we can't go there ever, but I've had many fantastic legal and compliance colleagues who've made projects work because we've sat down and agreed what is the goal and how do we ensure that nobody misunderstands our intention as we go there, and how can we create the guardrails and the communications around that. This can only work for medical affairs if it is ingrained in the entire organization, because medical affairs has to show where we are contributing within a broader enterprise framework. This can only work in terms of our benefit for society if we start sharing this way of thinking also with our stakeholders outside. So I very strongly encourage medical affairs colleagues to take a lead in their organizations, to also bring this into our strategic planning frameworks, eventually our tactical frameworks and performance frameworks. It has to be ingrained there, but completely, and demonstrates that it is part of our overall business targets, but that our overall business targets are completely aligned with health system strengthening. And that's what this approach and focus on care gaps is all about. It's basically saying that addressing care gaps is good for business, and we do have a duty to make a profit, a fair profit. I use my words carefully, but at the same time, as I mentioned, even if our products don't launch, we're benefiting society. So strongly advise legal compliance, and then your forecast colleagues as well.
One of the things that I've seen over the last, call it 6 months, having the chance to meet with teams about this, is a couple of teams have tried jumping in way too fast. And they'll, sit down, they'll bring in all the analytics and all the complexity without being ready, without agreeing on some of the principles up front. So one of the things that we've done, and I would encourage you to do with your teams, is to have a really basic, simple, don't overcomplicate it, readiness meeting. In fact, we won't start a project without first doing like a free readiness meeting to make sure we don't get into this and dedicate all of our time and energy to it. And then all of a sudden, it get canceled. So if anybody would like the agenda for a readiness meeting and the 4 or 5 questions that we asked, just put ready in the comments. I'll be sure to send it to you when we're done. But those readiness meetings are really valuable and helps everybody get on the same page before you need to commit to these. So
you have to find your allies in the organization. You have to really spend the time making sure that in every function you have representation of people who understand this and who want it. It's not necessarily come from top-down leadership. And then, what I'm beginning to learn is you need a sort of a core in the middle of the company who's got enough depth of knowledge into the details of what needs to be done, but still enough strategic, both interest and responsibility. So there needs to be sort of a happy middle ground of passionate people who can work upwards towards leadership and towards execution in the other direction as well.
As somebody earlier brought up field medical. So can you tell us a little about how you see, specifically for field, TPOs translating into goals, objectives, KPIs, measurements for field medical?
So no, I mean, in the end, field medical is one of our most powerful tactics, and not just in medical, but as an organization. So this will completely go all the way through in order to, are we affecting the right stakeholder belief and behaviors? That's, of course, again, where the compliance angle comes in, saying, is that acceptable on only a group level of MSLs, or could it actually even be eventually brought into individual MSL? I can see pros and cons on each side, but all I say is that we make ourselves accountable also with our field forces into actually, are we changing these or not? Having said that, also speaking as global, I would never encourage global to try and track field impact on belief and behavior. To me, that's between the first line manager and the MSL. That's kind of their thing to work out. Am I in target or not? And do I know how to course correct? Because as we all know, if we put targets on activity metrics, if we put targets on belief ladders, you will always get the top scores. I mean, I'm lucky I've been a rep, I've been an MSL, and I've been a CRA. I've always achieved or exceeded my activity metrics. It means nothing. It means something for course correction in terms of, well, are we actually targeting the right people? Are we ensuring that those external experts are perpetuating their knowledge to general HCPs? I'll perhaps just finish that bit on an anecdote that in one of the teams, in MSL teams in one country where we rolled this out, the way we presented it was, from now on, you're the chief medical officer of your territory. Your job is to know, where are my patients? Where are your patients? They are your patients, according to the TPP. Where are they? Where are they stuck? And who do you need to work with to move them up to the best current standard of care? That is now your job. And I can tell you the empowerment and excitement that generated and the innovation that released was truly exciting. And speaking as in a relatively long career so far, where the MSL portion of it was the most exciting part, then I would be delighted if I can give something back to my most important colleagues, the field force.
So I'm going to ask this one last question here. I have more, but I want to make sure for everybody that joined us live, if you have a question we haven't answered yet, put it in the chat now because we're coming up on time. But, the counter to that, Charles, is if we start to say, hey, in your country, in your territory, we want to set goals because you do, right? You said we want to change this TPO by a certain percentage points by the end of this year, in 3 years, in 5 years, whatever that is. But how do you hold a team accountable for something that they don't control all the factors around?
We have this, I guess McKinsey came up with this, the third pillar, clinical, commercial, medical in the middle. I like that because pillar to me smells too much like silo. But there is some value in that we have two neighbors where have very clear target, be it patient recruitment or being in sales. For those two organizations, they're not in complete control either. And the individual sub-functions are not in complete control. So I would say, sorry a bit harshly, but sort of welcome to the real world. This is what external accountability is about. What you are doing is saying, within reason, what are the things we can affect and the things we can't affect? And it comes back to how much do we understand if we're not on target? What are the things we might try to do differently in order to contribute to that? So I think it's about a maturing of thinking, specifically here about the medical function, about having a more, a target setting approach and saying that this is not about accusation or blame. This is about achieving the target. It's not about attribution. It's about how we're doing jointly to achieve it.
Love that. And I forget if you shared on this, but if an MSL isn't hitting a TPO target, are they doing a bad job?
No, not at all. And it's the same formula that as I mentioned. I've been very lucky. I've been a sales manager as well. As a sales manager, if a sales rep doesn't hit that target, you don't hold them out in front of the group and saying, colleague X hasn't hit that target. You are sitting together as a first-line manager, and you have 3 questions. Okay, you haven't met your target. Number 1, do you understand why? Number 2, what do you wish to change? And number 3, as a servant leader, how can I help you? So it's also a little bit about the psychological safety of an organization, that it is fine not to hit targets, but it's not fine not to know what to do about it, if you like. So, and actually it's a really important point, because one of my early experiences in working on this kind of thing is that when we got to the point where we started getting data in, all the data was positive. It was complete selection bias towards those teams who managed to hit the targets, whereas the others would say, "Oh, we're still working on the methodology, etc." So we made a massive mistake that we didn't work on the psychological safety around it. I think all in all, I really hope as people listen to this is that it's not, and we'll take away that it's not that we're not doing these measures already, but what it is shaping it into a very, very clear framework, which allows us to get rid of metrics and measures that don't help us. So we clean it up. But it also, if I can perhaps share a bit, it's fun, it's exciting. You're getting towards the end of the quarter, because these TPOs will change within an annual business cycle, but they won't change. You probably normally won't measure it monthly like with sales, but certainly within the quarter, you'll get to the end of the quarter and you start getting a bit worried, have I actually had the impact or not? But I can actually try and share with you, it's fun. It makes everything so clear. Do we have the right evidence? Is our integrated evidence plan going down to which stakeholder, which belief, which behavior? The same thing with our contribution to the omnichannel. So I hope it can convey it's not just another boring framework. It's actually, it really makes life exciting and fun.
Yeah, it's been my favorite work that I've had the opportunity to do. And I love that we get to talk about it. And in the last minute that we have here, Troels, do you want to share with everybody an opportunity to continue this conversation across organizations?
Very much so. Thank you, Scott. Scott actually in a previous conversation summarized it very nicely. For this kind of framework, TPOs is about 20% of the effort is to sort of understand it. And as one of my colleagues often says, once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. It's kind of, I'm sorry, but it sort of wires your brain. You start thinking about everything in this way. But that's 20% of the effort. 80% is organizational change. And that's pretty much what we've been talking about today. When I speak to colleagues, and a big thank you to Boehringer, who say that without mentioning anything confidential, I can speak, to colleagues about these principles. But one of the things I hear a lot about is, can we have a best practice forum? So that's something we're thinking about, not known in a rush, but probably by the end of the year or so, we have various companies who are willing to help us on a pro bono basis. This has nothing to do with profit. It's purely us, without really revealing anything confidential, how we can help each other with this. So you kindly said that if you're interested in being on a list to be part of such a community, above the company community, with clear rules about compliance and confidentiality, if you could perhaps type in community in the text, then I'd love to be in touch with you and invite you to be part shaping this. It may sound like it. My wife certainly said that I speak like I have all the answers. I honestly don't have all the answers, I promise you. So I would love to invite you to be part of evolving this concept together. So that's pharma, but it's also solution providers. We're all part of shaping a solution to this.
Great. Charles, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, you've asked great questions during the session, before the session. If anybody does have further questions, please send them to me. I'm sure we can get answers back to you. And thank you for everybody putting community in the chat here. It was a pleasure spending the last hour with you, and I look forward to seeing you next month, where we're going to be talking about how to apply this in field medical specifically. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.